Order. We start with questions to the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology. Thank you through.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 1.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. DSIT closely engages with all government departments on the adoption of AI, including with DHSC, and we are committed to ensuring the adoption of AI is done in an ethical, safe and responsible way. This includes using AI to improve public service outcomes and productivity in the NHS. Ahead of the AI Safety Summit last year, we announced a new AI in Healthcare fund backed by £100 million to target areas where rapid deployment of AI could create transformational breakthroughs.
Thank you through.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his answer. Without doubt, AI offers an opportunity to innovate in terms of medical diagnostics. Therefore, what discussions is my honourable friend having with colleagues from the Department for Health and Social Care to ensure that the next generation of clinical scientists, including radiologists and pathologists, get the right skills to make full use of AI?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that very important question. Ensuring the UK's life sciences sector can grow and access the variety of skills it needs to support innovation, including the adoption of AI, is a key commitment of the life sciences vision. To deliver this, we are working across government, including DFE and DHSC, industry and academia, to ensure our ecosystem can deliver and attract the interdisciplinary talent. I know the Health Secretary and the Department are also working to ensure the NHS can take advantage of the opportunity AI represents for healthcare. In addition, DSIT are actively represented on NHS England's radiology and pathology boards, where AI and skills are regularly discussed.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Health Select Committee's report into digital technologies of the future clearly demonstrated the opportunities that sit before us if we get the basics right. AI is not only of use for increasing productivity in diagnostics, but also setting treatment plans and in pharmacology. How is he setting out a strategic plan for how AI can be invested in the NHS for the future, like Labour has with our Fit for the Future plan?
Well, I thank the honourable member for that question. She's right, actually, that AI can play a great role in improving the way we treat conditions, provided it's implemented in an ethical, safe and responsible way. And one great example of that is Brainomics, which is already being used in 37 NHS healthcare trusts. It means that the in-out time has been greatly reduced, and 3 times more people who would have previously not been able to live independently are able to do so now because of the use of AI. And that is now also being used in additional critical pathways and learned lessons are, and I know the NHS is working closely with the HSC to make sure AI is used effectively.
So,
Number 2, sir.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 2, 4, 6 and 10 together. In the AI regulation white paper, we set out our ambitious pro-regulation, pro-innovation framework, outlining 5 cross-sectoral principles to be applied by existing regulators. In February, we published our response, setting out how we are supporting regulators to deliver the framework and strengthen our global AI leadership. This includes new funding and guidance for our regulators, and we have established a central risk function to support.
Yet we heard just a few months ago, Mr. Speaker, from the Prime Minister that the UK's answer is not to rush to regulate. The CMA has been clear in the potential harms unregulated AI could generate from baking in bases that affect certain demographics to general purpose models that could get out of control. So why has the government dragged its feet on safeguards for the most advanced AI models, or is it simply that she's waiting for the next Labour government to control the new AI models?
Mr. Speaker, this is absolute tosh. We have led the world when it comes to AI safety. We have set up a long-term process in the AI Safety Summit, and the next one will be in Seoul in just a few weeks. We have also set up the world's first leading AI safety institute that is testing both pre and post deployment. But we've also been really clear, we're not going to rush to legislate. We're going to grip the risks and better understand them, rather than produce out-of-date legislation as a gimmick.
Justin Bathurst.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow, the TUC will officially launch its AI Regulation and Employment Rights Bill, which recognises that transparency, observability and explainability are all key elements of a fair and just workplace. So what are the government going to do to make sure that AI doesn't lead to a weakening of workers' rights?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We want to gauge the opportunities for the British public of AI, which includes the complementary aspect it can pose for jobs, especially things like teaching and in medicine, taking away some of the admin and the bureaucracy. But we're also very realistic that technology always changes labour market needs. In 1940, 60% of the jobs then now did not exist then, and that's why we have undergone a revolution in our skills system, including the launch of LLE next year.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's all very well the government saying they're going to take their time over this response. But the point is, the FSB are saying that regulatory framework is urgent, and Dr. Rogoyski of Surrey University is pointing out that delay could mean the UK probably having no choice but to follow the US and Europe's approach to AI regulation. So can she now set out, please, exactly what the time frame will be for regulation?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the honourable member is getting confused between regulation and legislation. We already have a plethora of regulation and world-leading regulators who we're supporting. We were very clear in our white paper response that when it comes to legislation, we will legislate, as will every nation around the world, but we want to get that legislation right. She commented on the US's approach. We're working hand in glove with the US, and I signed the world's first MOU on AI institutes just a few weeks ago.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assessment has the government made of the United Nations plans to internationally regulate artificial intelligence and the implications for UK sovereign security?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK government is committed to unlocking the opportunities of AI, whilst of course mitigating the risks. And this requires both domestic action, but also international action. And the UK is a leading voice internationally, hosting, as I've said, the AI Safety Summit, which delivered the world's first Bletchley Declaration, as well as actively participating at the UN. This includes our proactive role shaping UNESCO recommendations on AI ethics.
Chair of the Select Committee, Greg Clark.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary knows that leading AI developers are expected imminently to release new, more sophisticated AI models. So can the Secretary of State confirm that our AI Safety Institute has had access to these models, as was agreed at Bletchley Park? And is it the case that the developers have made changes to their models where they've been requested by the Institute?
Yeah, thank you very much. I know the honourable member shares my passion and enthusiasm for this topic, but also desire to make sure that we grip the risks. Our institute is the first institute in the world to be doing pre- and post-deployment testing in line with the agreement that we made at Bletchley Park. I can't get into the specifics of which models we're testing, as I'm sure the honourable member would understand this is highly commercially sensitive information. But what I can assure him and the House, where risks are found, we do expect relevant action to be taken, and the responsibility of developers is to ensure that their models are safe. But of course, government is committed to holding them to account.
Oliver Hill.
Does my right honourable friend agree with me that to spread best practice in this field is perhaps the most important thing? And so, for example, with the health benefits that have already been mentioned of AI, for example, in the diagnosis of bowel cancer, these are things which are about promoting the health of the public at large, and these need to be pushed forward with urgency. It's not just enough to try and slow things down and over-regulate.
I absolutely agree. AI has the potential to be revolutionary, especially in areas like healthcare, which is why at the summit we announced a £100 million pot to accelerate some of our existing healthcare missions. And we are working hand in hand with the Department of Health and Social Care on this very important topic.
Shadow Minister Matt Rodder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. AI is an incredible new technology, and it can help the NHS to save. There are also risks, such as the danger of deep fakes. And the government has been warned about these risks. Yet time and again, ministers have dithered and delays, and the government's failure to act was highlighted in the FT this week. So could I ask the Secretary of State, has the government run out of ideas, or is it just scared of its own backbenchers?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Honourable Member will know, we have a Defending Democracy task force that is dedicated to this very subject, led by the Security Minister, and we as a team are actively participating. We're also working with social media companies and our international counterparts. It's something that I personally put on the agenda at the summit. It's something that I personally discussed at forums like the G7. The Deputy Prime Minister is also leading the way with his AI compact. There is no easy answer to this, but we are working in a conciliatory and speedily manner to ensure that we address all opportunities and answers.
Bob Blackman.
Question number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The data bill before Parliament builds on the high standards we already have for personal data protection. It strengthens and modernises the regulator so that it can enforce standards much more robustly to protect people. And we're looking at what we can do to strengthen our cyber resilience and data infrastructure all the time as new technology develops.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for that answer. Clearly, it's vital that the enormous amounts of personal data that are collected by government departments and private companies must be safeguarded. I've had a number of complaints to me about people's personal data being abused by companies, and indeed from the public sector it being sold to companies who then use it. Just this weekend, our GLA candidate had his phone hacked and his social media destroyed. That's equally important as a demonstration of what can happen to democracy when data is abused. So can my honourable friend take further action to safeguard people's personal data?
Well, I thank him for highlighting that case, and I regret what's happened to the GLA candidate, and it does highlight some of the risks that we all carry in relation to technology. That's why we have a very high data protection standards, but also there's a range of ways in which we need to tackle this problem. We have the National Cyber Strategy, which is working to make sure that we can deal with the cyber threats that we face. We're taking measures to protect our data infrastructure, to trying to do things to stop fraud in the National Stop Think Fraud Strategy, and new laws on security of devices like connected devices. So there's a whole range of things we need to do, but we need to keep making sure that we're vigilant about the risks.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, when my 91-year-old mother died, for purely sentimental reasons, I took on her landline. For months and months and months after that, I kept on getting scam calls offering all sorts of dodgy products. Does the Minister agree with me that the elderly must have their ID, their personal data protected almost more than anyone?
Well, I'm sorry to hear about the experience of my honourable friend's mother, and I'm afraid it's one that's shared by constituents across the country. That's why we have taken new measures in the data bill to try and deal with these problems of scam calls and try and make sure we can see data and see where those numbers are and take action so we can block them on bulk. But I appreciate what he's saying, and it's something that we must tackle.
Senator Minister Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are told this year is general election year. Already in other countries, we have seen those who want to manipulate democracy use AI to scrape together personal details like someone's face and voice, allow them to falsify candidates' views. And I think it was quite pertinent the honourable member for Harrow East raised that about a GLA candidate. As we quickly approach the second half of the year, when we are told the Prime Minister will finally call the election, will the government commit to ensure personal details are protected for candidates, voters, and above all, democracy as a matter of urgency?
Well, we absolutely share those concerns. That's why we have a Defending Democracy task force that's working across every government department to look at the threats to our democracy. It's a very substantial threat that we face, and one that we all have to be mindful of in the way in which we conduct ourselves as candidates. AI and fakes and the protection of data is one element of that, but I want to assure the House that we have a whole range of measures that we're taking to make sure that the protection of this coming general election is robust.
SNP spokesperson Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Individuals' personal data is not safe in Tory hands. A recent article in The Guardian reported that senior Tory party officials plan to make millions from selling off their own members' data through the True Blue app. Now, if the Tory party is happy to sell off personal data of their own members, how can the public possibly have confidence that their data is safe under this government?
The allegations that the lady has put forward, I mean, they were written in The Guardian. They're not any that I have seen myself. I'm presiding over the data bill. I've seen no evidence to suggest that we are trying to bring forward laws that would do such things.
Thank you, Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ofcom is the independent regulator of the Online Safety Act. The government is working with them to implement the Act as quickly as possible, including the relevant secondary legislation. Ofcom is taking a phased approach to bringing the duties into effect and is consulting on guidance and codes of practice. Offences around serious online abuse came into effect the 31st of January this year.
Thank you, Ford.
The Online Safety Act did introduce many measures to keep children safe online, but given the increased concerns about children's online safety, does she agree it is now time to go even further and introduce a child-safe phone, thus ensuring that at a minimum all phones intended for children are properly fitted with parental controls to stop children from accessing harmful content?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, the government did produce world-leading legislation when it comes to online safety, which puts the onus on social media companies and not the parents. I know that my honourable friend has spoken about information before, which is particularly important in making it as easy as possible for parents. She does raise an important point regarding device-level controls, and I can assure her that I'm listening not just to members of this House, but also to parents too.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Yesterday, the government finally backed Labour's calls and announced they would be making the creation of deepfake porn a criminal offence. However, it is disappointing that the government continue to adopt an intent-based approach over one of consent in relation to these crimes. Why are ministers prioritising a man's right to have banter over a woman's right to feel safe? And will the government look at the regulation of the AI apps such as Nudify and Cloth Off, which are freely available, easy to use, and exist only to humiliate and violate women?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share the honourable member's passion for this area. It's why we put it in the Online Safety Act in regards to the sharing of this content. And now we have gone one step further and made it illegal. Well, we're in the process of making it illegal to create this content in the first place.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Number 7, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is clear that artificial intelligence is the defining technology of our time, with the potential to transform humanity positively, but it also recognises the challenges that AI can pose. As has already been said, we are working to ensure that we respond to the full range of threats to our democratic processes, including through the DEFDEM task force. DCIT is engaging with social media platforms, civil society groups, academia and international partners to tackle the risk AI can pose to democracy.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the longer term, I absolutely agree. AI has enormous potential to support participation in politics, and we should seek to harness that. But in the short term, disinformation and deepfakes, often put together by foreign actors, threaten to have the most immediate impact on democracy. So what risk does he believe that AI poses to this year's election in particular, and what steps is he taking to alleviate those risks?
Mr. Speaker, let me be very, very clear. The UK will not tolerate malicious cyber activity targeting our democratic institutions. We've already had the Deputy Prime Minister come to this dispatch box and take definitive action where that has happened. DEFDEM and government teams are working collaboratively to ensure that we can respond to threats to our democratic processes, including digitally manipulated content. And the Online Safety Act will also force companies to take proactive, preventative action against illegal state-sponsored content online via the foreign interference offence, including deepfakes and other AI-generated content in scope of the act.
In 2 short sentences, will the Minister reassure us that AI is not going to destroy not just destroy democracy, but the human race as well?
In 2 sentences, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that the government is taking a proactive approach to AI, full stop, and that DEFDEM is working very hard to protect our democratic processes, full stop.
We come to topical Samja.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want the British people to be able to seize the extraordinary opportunities that AI offers, but that can only happen if we address the risks. At Bletchley Park, we kick-started a global conversation, and since then, the Bletchley Effect has seen countries from around the world collaborating on the development of safe, responsible and trustworthy AI. 2 weeks ago, I signed an agreement with the United States allowing us to collaborate seamlessly on AI safety testing. And last week, we announced the date of the second AI Safety Summit in Seoul. We also remain laser focused on implementing the landmark Online Safety Act, which will make Britain the safest place to be online. And last month, we saw the first sentencing under the cyber flashing offences that we brought in January.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A fast and reliable internet connection is vital for everyday life and so many local businesses. I conducted a broadband survey in East Devon. Some rural parts of my constituency still sadly lag behind: Sidbury, Fluxton, Marsh Green and Tallerton. What steps is the government taking to make sure that broadband providers improve connections across our county?
Well, I'm glad to say that over 75% of premises in his constituency can access gigabit-capable broadband. That's up from 6% in 2019. But we want to do more, so we've included Mid and East Devon in our cross-regional framework for Project Gigabit, and that's currently undertaking pre-procurement market engagement, and we hope to be giving the news very soon.
Shall the Secretary, Peter Kyle?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The first act of this Prime Minister was to promise a government of professionalism and integrity. Yet here we have a Secretary of State who uses her position to accuse a British scientist of being a terrorist sympathiser. She goes on to use public money to settle her libel, and then she tries to cover up just how much taxpayers' money she wasted. Can she tell the House, are these the actions of someone with integrity and professionalism? Yes or no?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister responsible for UKRI, officials in my department alerted me to a tweet which stated, "This is disturbing. Suella Braverman urges police to crack down on Hamas support in the UK," with no further context or wording. This was posted by a representative of an EDI board that sits under UKRI. At the time, like many others, I was indeed concerned and used the forum in which she used to alert UKRI to my concerns. This was highlighted using that medium, but on receipt of the letter, UKRI CEO themselves said that they were deeply concerned and launched an investigation.
Thank you, Paul.
Mr. Speaker, WhatsApp can be very handy, but it can also be very dangerous. Its end-to-end encryption means even the most vile illegal content like child sexual abuse cannot be policed or prevented. Given the obvious dangers to children, does she agree that it is woefully irresponsible of Meta to reduce the age for WhatsApp to 13?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are pro-innovation, but also pro-privacy. However, it is clearly not right for anyone to be exposed to such harms as sexual abuse, extortion, or grooming on any service. Platforms must have robust processes in place to safeguard children in response to the Online Safety Act. Responsible encryption has an important role to play in protecting privacy, but it shouldn't compromise safety, and Ofcom will take robust action when this is compromised.
John Youngs on the answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the Lord Science Committee, the Secretary of State said there had been no surveillance of academics in that case. Mr. Speaker, what was the evidence which she based her decision to write to the UKRI Chief Exec on then?
Mr. Speaker, I've answered that multiple times. An official alerted me to these concerns. I then saw the tweet myself, and also I asked the department for further advice.
The Kettering-based company Intertech is the only company in the world that can manufacture and completely recycle circuit board technology. The potential for it and for the UK is huge. Would the Minister for Science, Research and Innovation be kind enough, please, to visit Intertech in Kettering to see this groundbreaking innovation for himself?
Mr. Speaker, Intertech is indeed a great example of innovation in sustainable electronics. I was pleased that they benefited from £250,000 in UK support, and it would be my pleasure to visit my honourable friend's constituency in Kettering, and I believe we've got a date soon.
Gregory Campbell.
Mr. Speaker, Northern Ireland should have virtually 100% access to fibre broadband, which is a first in any of these islands, following the confidence and supply agreement with the previous government. Does he agree with me that regions like Northern Ireland and other regions in the UK should take full advantage of that broadband access to maximise employment opportunities across these islands?
Absolutely, he's right about the importance of gigabit broadband to the economy. I'm very glad to say that 95% of Northern Ireland has that access. So it's the highest percentage in the country, and that's a tribute to the work done between central government and the Assembly.
Sir Edmund Lee.
Why should people living in rural areas be second-class citizens when it comes to mobile phone coverage?
Well, we agree. That's why we have the Shared Rural Network programme that is dealing with a lot of those not-spot problems.
Tim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, the number of black students entering into STEM are leaving in great numbers. So can you say what you're doing to identify the challenges and what you're doing to help progression of black students in STEM?
Mr. Speaker, the government is absolutely committed to expanding STEM opportunities. A key way of doing that is building mathematical capabilities, helping girls and minorities stick with maths. That's why the Prime Minister announced our ambition to see all young people receive maths education until aged 18.
Final question, Nigel Mills.
Amber Valley has a high incidence of respiratory disease. So what more can the government do to increase investment in research into respiratory conditions in the areas that need that research the most?
The Medical Research Council is benefiting from the highest ever level of research spend. I'd be very happy to meet with my honourable friend to talk about what more we can do in this important area.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Sir Len Saxby.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are joined today in the gallery by postmasters caught up in the Horizon IT scandal. It is one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our history, and that is why we've introduced a bill to quash convictions, delivered schemes to ensure swift compensation, and established an independent inquiry. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Sir Len Saxby.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree towns like Barnstaple, the main transport hub in North Devon, serving hundreds of square miles, should have a fully functioning bus station, as Lib Dem run North Devon Council has not reopened now since the pandemic, leaving residents out in the cold with no public facilities? As people start to feel the difference with tax cuts and falling inflation, does he agree we should be making it easier for people to use the bus, come to town and support Barnstable's local economy? And will my right honourable friend join me in calling on the Lib Dems to get on with reopening the bus station?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we know how vital bus services are for communities right across the country. That's why we're providing Devon with £17 million to deliver better bus services, and we introduced the £2 fare bus cap. But I know my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, was recently visiting my honourable friend, seeing the benefits of reopening Barnstable bus station, and it's clear that the local Liberal Democrats should just get on and do it.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Can I too welcome the postmasters in the gallery in their quest for justice? And Mr. Speaker, this week we marked 35 years since the disaster at Hillsborough, and the enduring courage and determination of the families must be marked by the passing of a Hillsborough law. Mr. Speaker, we also lost Lord Richard Rosser, a lifelong member of the Labour Party. He will be greatly missed, and our thoughts are with his wife Sheena, his family and friends. Mr. Speaker, I'm privileged to be the proud owner of a copy of the former Prime Minister's new book. It's a rare, unsigned copy. It's the only unsigned copy. It's quite the read. She claims the Tory party's disastrous kamikaze budget that triggered chaos for millions was, her words, the happiest moment of her premiership. Has the Prime Minister met anyone with a mortgage who agrees?
Well, Mr. Speaker, all I'd say is he ought to spend a bit less time reading that book and a bit more time reading the Deputy Leader's tax advice.
I think we'll have less talking. I want to get through PMQs. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we've got a billionaire Prime Minister and a billionaire Prime Minister, both of whose families have used schemes to avoid millions of pounds of tax, smearing a working class woman. And I know. And the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, has a long list of people to blame for the economic misery. They don't want to hear it. They made her Prime Minister, and millions of people are paying the price. She's got a long list of people to blame. She blames the Governor of the Bank of England, the Treasury, the Office for Budget Responsibility. The American President is blamed at one point. We even learned that the poor old lettuce was part of the deep state. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's actually much simpler than that? It was the Tories' unfunded tax cuts, tens of billions of pounds of unfunded tax cut, that crashed the economy and left millions paying more on their mortgages, wasn't it?
Mr. Speaker, everyone knows that 2 years ago I wasn't afraid to repeatedly warn about what her economic policies would lead to, even if it wasn't what people wanted to hear at the time. Mr. Speaker, I was right then, but I'm also right now when I say that his economic policies would be a disaster for Britain. He would send inflation up, mortgages up, and taxes up, and working people would pay the price.
Well, I appreciate the Prime Minister having the stomach to say it out loud, but everyone knows it's the Tory party's obsession with wild, unfunded tax cuts that crashed the economy. We know it, he knows it, they know it, and the whole country is living it. So when is he finally going to learn the lesson from his predecessor's mistakes and explain where the money is coming from for his own completely unfunded £46 billion promise to scrap national insurance?
Mr. Speaker, when my predecessor was running for leader, to use his words, I did have the stomach to argue out loud about her economic policies, had the conviction to say that they were wrong, but not once, but twice. He tried to make his predecessor Prime Minister. Despite him opposing NATO and Trident, ignoring anti-Semitism and siding with our enemies. It's clear what he did. He put his own interests ahead of Britain's.
I think actually when he was running for Prime Minister, for leader, he was explaining how he's funneling money from poor areas to pay it into richer areas. We know what his record is. I notice he's not denying the £46 billion promise to scrap the national insurance, but is refusing to say where the money will come from. And we've been trying for months to get to the bottom of this. So now's his chance. No more spin, no more waffle, no more diversion. I know that'll be difficult. He can either, Mr. Speaker, this is the choice, he can either cut state pension or the NHS that national insurance funds, that's route one, or he can put up income tax. Which one is it?
Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, we've just cut taxes by £900 for a typical worker. We've delivered the biggest tax cut for businesses since the 1980s. But while we're cutting taxes, Labour is already putting them up. In Wales, putting up taxes right now for small businesses. In Birmingham, putting up council tax by 21%. And in London, his mayor has put up taxes by 70%, Mr. Speaker. And this is just a glimpse of what they'd do if they got in power. A few weeks ago, he finally admitted it to The Sun. What would he say he would do? I quote, he said, "We would put up taxes." It's always the same, Mr. Speaker. Higher taxes and working people paying the price.
No single politician has ever put tax up more times than he has. But Mr. Speaker, just hang on, because he was given the chance. He was just given the chance to rule out cutting the NHS or state pensions to pay for scrapping this. No, I was a lawyer long enough to know when someone's avoiding the question. So I'm going to give him another chance. Will he now rule out cuts to the NHS, cuts the state pension, or putting up taxes to pay for his unfunded £46 billion promise to scrap national insurance? Which is it?
Mr. Speaker, I make absolutely no apology about wanting to end the unfairness of the double taxation on work, Mr. Speaker. The NHS is receiving record funding under this Conservative government. Pensioners have just received a £900 increase under this government. But if he wants to talk about tax, let's have a look at what Labour's brand newly appointed tax advisor has to say. This advisor thinks that supporting pensioners is a complete disgrace, Mr. Speaker. He believes their free TV licences are ridiculous. And if it wasn't bad enough, this advisor has called for increases in income tax, in national insurance and VAT. It all makes sense now. That's who the Shadow Chancellor's been copying and pasting from.
So this is genuinely extraordinary. Two chances to rule out, Mr. Speaker, two chances to rule out cuts to state pension, cuts to the NHS, or income tax rises to fund his promise to abolish national insurance.
Order. Mr. Hull, I want you to set a good example, not a bad one.
Mr. Speaker, this really matters. He's had two chances to rule out these cuts to NHS, cuts to tax or pensions or tax rises. This matters to millions of people watching who want to know what's going to happen to their NHS and pensions. It really does matter to millions of people who are watching. So I'll be really generous now and give him one last chance. Very simple, very clear. Is his £46 billion promise to abolish national insurance being paid for by cuts to the NHS, cuts to the state pension, or yet another Tory tax rise?
Mr. Speaker, he's really got to keep up, Mr. Speaker, right? It's this government that's just delivered a £900 increase to the state pension. It's this government that's already committed to the triple lock for the next parliament. He had 6 opportunities. I didn't think I heard him say that, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to the NHS, you'd much rather be treated in Conservative-run NHS in England, not the Labour-run NHS in Wales, Mr. Speaker. But it's another week where all we heard is political sniping, Mr. Speaker, not a word about their plans for the country. He's failed to acknowledge that since we last met, taxes have been cut by £900, state pensions gone up, free childcare has been expanded, wages have risen for 9 months in a row, Mr. Speaker, and just today, inflation down again to 3.2%. Our plan is working and the Conservatives are delivering a brighter future for Britain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you will not be surprised to learn that I very much welcome the £20 million allocated to Carlton in my Gedling constituency as part of the long-term plan for towns. But I'm very eager to see that this money is spent according to local wishes. I know there'll be consultations following the setting up of the Towns Board, so will my right honourable friend join me in urging Carlton residents to take part in those forthcoming consultations, to make sure their voices are heard and to ensure that this money is spent where the people want?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his tireless campaigning on behalf of the residents of Carlton? Our long-term plan for towns means that 75 towns across the country, including Carlton, will benefit from £20 million each to invest in their local area. But crucially, as he said, that will be in the hands of local people deciding on their priorities for the place that we live, whether it's regenerating local high streets, investing in parks and green spaces, or tackling antisocial behaviour. We're levelling up across the country, and he deserves enormous praise for his role in securing that investment.
SNP leader Stephen Flint.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, a former Prime Minister who oversaw a financial crash before being unceremoniously turfed from office told the public the truth, and I'm not referring to that one, Mr. Speaker, because on Monday, Gordon Brown told the people of these Isles that the forces pulling Britain apart are greater than the forces holding it together. So maybe the Prime Minister can find some time this afternoon to perhaps agree with just one of his predecessors.
Well, Mr. Speaker, where I do agree with my predecessor very strongly is that Scotland would be far stronger inside the United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, of course, where Gordon Brown was also correct was in stating that Scottish independence is not simply off the agenda. And indeed, those remarks were echoed just yesterday by the General Secretary of the Scottish Trade Union Congress, who stated that it remains an unresolved issue, Mr. Speaker, before going on to state, and I confirm, and they may laugh at her, but she said, that can be a very dangerous place to end up in when you are not allowing people to express their wishes in a democratic manner. So may I ask the Prime Minister, does he welcome the fulsome, wholehearted and warm support of the Labour Party in denying the people of Scotland that opportunity to have a say over their own future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we did have a democratic vote on that topic, but what I would suggest to the SNP is that rather than obsessing about independence and indeed wasting time cracking down on free speech and trying to lock up J.K. Rowling, he should focus on what the people of Scotland actually care about: schools, hospitals, jobs, and our new tax cuts.
Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I abhor a two-tier policing system, and we must ensure that everyone's treated equally under the rule of law. The Labour Police and Crime Commissioner who investigated the Beergate scandal handed their police chief constable a new 3-year contract whilst the investigation into the Labour Party leader and deputy leader was ongoing. Now, 2 former Labour MPs are overseeing the force due to investigate the opposition deputy leader. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that complete transparency throughout this investigation is of the utmost importance?
My right honourable friend makes an important point. A key principle of our country is that there are the same rules for everyone. And when it comes to this topic, I do think the Labour leader should show some leadership. Avoid stop reading the legal advice, simply just publish it and get a grip of the situation. And it says a lot about his priorities, that when it comes to his famed legal expertise, he's more than happy to help defend Hizb ut-Tahrir, but refuses to help his own deputy leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The recently published Canova report makes it absolutely clear that the IRA was riddled with British agents from top to bottom. Those agents were involved in abduction, torture and murder of British and Irish citizens. The British government, successive British governments, knew all about it and did nothing. The report also calls for an apology from the government to those victims. Will the Prime Minister take this opportunity now to make that apology?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman will know, this is an interim report, as the Secretary of State has laid out. We can't comment on the findings until we get the final report, but we would never condone wrongdoing where there is evidence of this. But I will say this also, because it's not said enough. The overwhelming majority of the police, armed forces and intelligence services serve with great distinction. They defended democracy in the face of some horrendous violence, and without their service and their sacrifice, there would have been no peace process. They helped ensure that the future of Northern Ireland will never be decided by violence, but by the consent of its people.
Sir Simon Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me? We don't agree on everything, but we do agree on this, that if anyone wants to see why this government has introduced strong mayors, they need only look to Ben Houchen in the Tees Valley. Because from saving our airport to introducing our free port to bringing steelmaking back, Ben delivers. And does my right honourable friend agree with me that the best thing that Ben has done is do this without charging any mayoral tax, which his Labour opponent would need to do to fund his unfunded spending plans?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the great work of Ben Houchen, and I share his concerns about the pledges of the Labour candidate. Over £130 million of unfunded spending, showing that Labour can't be trusted. And we all see the results of this, Mr. Speaker, in Labour-run Birmingham. Taxes going up by 20%. And that is the story of what Labour in local government means. Working people paying the price, and it's exactly why he and I completely agree on this. The people of Teesside should vote Ben Houchen and vote Conservative.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last year in Shropshire, 10,000 people waited for more than 24 hours in A&E That's 10,000 people over 65 waiting on hard plastic chairs or in trolleys in our accident and emergency department. The Prime Minister tells us he's got a plan for the NHS, but what people in North Shropshire want to know is how long they are going to have to wait for him to get on and fix the issues where we are.
Well, Mr. Speaker, with the record funding that we're putting into the NHS, our urgent emergency care plan is delivering more ambulances, more beds, but also faster discharge through our hospitals to speed the flow, and that plan is working. Of course, there's more to do, but this winter we saw ambulance and A&E waiting times improve from the year before for the first time in many years, and if we stick to the plan, we'll continue to deliver improvement for her constituents and everyone else.
Gareth Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, somebody earning £15,000 a year paid £1,700 in income tax. Today, somebody earning £15,000 a year pays less than £500 of tax. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that this has helped create jobs, growth and self-reliance?
My honourable friend is quite right, and because of our plan, the economy, after a tough few years, has indeed turned the corner. Inflation has fallen from over 11% to 3.2%. It's forecast to return back to target in just a few months, a year ahead of expectations. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we've been able to cut people's taxes, a tax cut, as he mentioned, worth £900 for an average worker, which, by the way, is part of our plan to end the long-term unfairness of the double taxation on work.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 4 years ago, my constituent Juliana was drugged and raped by her then boyfriend. After his conviction, Juliana was advised that reading a transcript of his trial would help her to come to terms with her experience. But when she requested that transcript, she was told that she would have to pay more than £7,000. Astonishingly, Juliana is not alone. I have heard about victims who've been quoted fees of up to £22,000 just to read trial transcripts that are part of their own story. Mr. Speaker, justice should not have a price tag. The Liberal Democrats' amendment to the Victims Bill would give all victims the right to read sentencing remarks and summings up free of charge. Juliana is here in the gallery today, and she asks if the Prime Minister will support that amendment. Will he look her in the eye and say yes?
Mr. Speaker, I'm extremely sorry to hear about Juliana's case, and my sympathies with her and indeed her family. We are committed to improving victims' access to court transcripts to help them move on and rebuild their lives. We already offer a free service to families of homicide victims, for example, and that's why we have already committed to a one-year pilot to help identify the current demand, inform our next steps, and alongside this, we're actively looking at other options to immediately reduce the costs.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, Bracknell Forest Council has a particular challenge with special educational needs, and I'm keen to support them. I am grateful to the government for the recent SEN review, the significant increase in resources and the bespoke safety valve programme for Bracknell, but additional school places are needed now. Could the Prime Minister please agree today to release the funding for our new SEN units at Sandhurst and Edgebarrow schools and commit to fully funding up front our new SEN school in Crowthorne?
Can I thank my honourable friend for highlighting how Bracknell Forest's local authority has worked positively with the department through the safety valve programme. And as part of that agreement, over the next few years, the council will receive £16 million in extra funding to provide the vital education that my honourable friend's constituents deserve. I'm told that the department is still reviewing capital bids for the safety valve programme, but they will be in touch with local authorities directly as soon as possible.
Daniel Zagner.
In the exchanges earlier, we didn't hear much of a defence from the Prime Minister of his predecessor, so perhaps he could tell the House, what does he consider to be her greatest achievement?
Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, while the party opposite were busy trying to take us back into the EU and reverse the referendum result, my predecessor was signing trade deals around the world, which have now meant, Mr. Speaker, that Brexit Britain has overtaken the Netherlands, France, and Japan to become the fourth largest exporter in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Claire Massey, and one of her two children almost lost their lives in a fire at her home in February 2023. Since then, Claire has been a victim of bullying by aggressive claims handlers and negligent and unprofessional conduct, including violating a policy and withdrawing alternative accommodation by the insurer, policy expert, part of the accredited Insurance Europe Group and Limited Trinity Claims Management. Claire has raised institutional failings with the Financial Conduct Authority, which appears toothless. She's also successfully raised individual issues with the Financial Ombudsman, but the delaying tactics of the insurance means she's no closer to a resolution. Claire is here in the gallery today and is asking, will the Prime Minister meet with her and me to look at how we can better protect consumers against bad practices in the insurance industry? And does he agree with me that it is time to establish an Office of the Whistleblower?
My honourable friend is an excellent campaigner on behalf of her constituent, and can I extend my sympathies to Claire and her family. Whilst I can't comment on individual cases, I'm sure she'll understand, I know that the Financial Conduct Authority does have the powers that it needs to take action against firms that breach its rules, and further customers can contact the Financial Ombudsman Service, whose decisions are binding on insurers. But I will immediately ensure that the relevant minister meets with my honourable friend to look more closely at the specific issue and the case that she raises.
Ukrainian Member of Parliament, Mykola Stefanchuk, is in the public gallery this afternoon. I'm sure we all wish to welcome him and wish Ukraine, Slavy Ukraine. Mykola has told me that Ukraine has the people, Ukraine has the courage, but Ukraine does not currently have the weapons and the air defence to secure her freedom. In light of today's Russian attack on Chernihiv this morning, which has killed at least 10 and injured many more, can I ask the Prime Minister, will he respond to President Zelensky's statement that this would not have happened if Ukraine had received sufficient air defence equipment?
Mr. Speaker, it was a pleasure to address members of the Ukrainian Parliament when I visited Ukraine earlier this year. Indeed, it was my first foreign visit of the year. I was the first foreign leader to visit Ukraine and President Zelensky to demonstrate our strong support for the Ukrainian people at their moment of struggle against Russian aggression. We've increased the amount of support that we've given to Ukraine this year, indeed the first major country to do so, and a big part of that support concerns air defence, where we have led in supporting Ukraine's efforts, will continue to do so, and also continue to encourage other countries around the world to step up and match our leadership, because we all want to see a future for Ukraine based on freedom from tyranny.
Mr. Speaker, on a recent visit to Pimlico in my constituency, the Prime Minister heard directly from local people concerned about the eye-watering rise in violent crime and robberies. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the London Labour Mayor has failed to take advantage of extra government funding to recruit more police, and that on the 2nd of May, Londoners can send him a very clear message, he's let them down?
Mr. Speaker, Sadiq Khan is failing London. While burglary is down across England, it's up in London. Violent crime down across England, but up in London. And the Labour Mayor is the only one of 43 police and crime commissioners to have missed his police recruitment target. Londoners will have the chance, Mr. Speaker, to cast their vote on the 2nd of May, and I hope that they kick him out, because we all know they'll be safer with Susan Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My local community is reeling from the discovery of 35 bodies and unidentifiable cremated ashes at a local funeral home. Their pain has been made worse when they realise the funeral plans they'd used their life savings for were fake. Does the Prime Minister agree that in these unique and limited circumstances, banks should offer discretion when deciding if chargeback applies to payment refunds?
Can I express my sympathies to the families affected by the case that the Honourable Lady raises? I believe that Ministry of Justice are urgently looking at the matter that she's raised. I'll ensure that someone gets in touch with her as soon as possible.
Derek Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Robotic surgery allows laparoscopic surgery to be performed with increased precision, flexibility and control. This can result in reduced patient complication rates, reduced length of stay in hospital, and reduced hospital readmissions. However, there is currently no robotic surgery provision in Cornwall. As a result, residents of Cornwall have to travel to Devon for robotic procedures, a journey of more than 80 miles, 120 miles if you're from Ellerslie, for West Cornwall and Ellerslie residents. Will my friend the PM, the Prime Minister, commit to ring-fence capital funding for
for Cornwall to establish a robotic surgery service and address the health inequalities our constituents have lived with for far too long.
Can I thank my honourable friend for highlighting the potential of this innovative technology for patient care. I'm delighted to see that more generally Cornwall is benefiting from our new hospital programme, providing a new women's and children's hospital in the centre of Royal Cornwall, which he and I discussed when I was last with him. But I can also tell him that NHS England are actively exploring opportunities to expand robotic-assisted surgery. Any decisions on funding new allocations will factor in health inequalities, such as areas with less access to robots today, and I will ensure that the current access to robotic surgery in my honourable friend's local community is appropriately considered by the relevant health minister.
George Galloway.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister told us on Monday that he was off to make a telephone call to Mr. Netanyahu to urge restraint on a government that has killed and maimed well over 100,000 people in 6 months, 72% of them women and children. Can you tell us how the telephone call went and what he will do if his advice is not taken and an unrestrained war begins?
Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to speak with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who thanked the UK for their support of Israel's security over the weekend. We also discussed the situation and how Iran is isolated on the world stage. And also I made the point to him that significant escalation is not in anyone's interest, and it's a time for calm heads to prevail. I also reiterated our concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, where I welcome the statements and commitments that the Israeli government have made about significantly increasing aid into Gaza, and now we need to see those commitments delivered.
Nigel Bills.
Thank you. The residents in Smalley and Denby are now faced by two huge solar farm applications with only a 500-metre gap between them. And both sites are wholly in the Greenbelt. So would the Prime Minister agree we should change planning guidance to make it absolutely clear that productive farms in the Greenbelt are not the right place for solar farms, and the investment and the time being spent should go on sites that might be appropriate, like car parks or brownfield land or roofs of industrial buildings, rather than wasting people's time and causing fear like this?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right that particularly at a time of increased geopolitical risk, we must protect our nation's food security and therefore our most valuable agricultural land. We do want to see more solar, which is one of the cheapest forms of energy, but as he said, on brownfield sites, rooftops, and away from our best agricultural land. And that's why our recently published National Infrastructure Planning Rules set out the requirement for solar not to be placed on what is described as best and most valuable versatile land where possible. The Energy and Environment Secretaries are ensuring that developers and planning authorities strike the right balance so that we can deliver what he wants, which is more British food grown here at home.
That's from McKinnell.
Out recently with Chris McEwen, the mayoral candidate in Teesside, it was clear that residents are really worried about crime. Levels in Tory-run Teesside are some of the highest in the country. Residential burglary rate is 52% higher than anywhere else in the country. When will the Prime Minister realise that he's not only lost control of his party, but of crime in this country too?
I mean, Mr. Speaker, what a joke, right? We've got police and crime commissioner elections across the country, and the honourable lady really should look at the record. Under this government, crime has been cut by 50%, 20,000 more police officers. But here are the facts, and this is why it's so extraordinary to hear what she said. People with a Labour police and crime commissioner are more likely to be victims of burglary and twice as likely to be victims of robbery. The facts completely speak for themselves. Vote Conservatives for safer streets.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every month, my constituents see the Labour-run Warrington Council spend nearly £4.5 million on interest payments to cover their £1.8 billion debt. Borrowing they've used to spend on an energy company that went bust, offices in Birmingham and Manchester, and even a business park that they purchased through an offshore company, presumably to avoid paying tax. Does the Prime Minister agree with me? It's time to send in the inspectors. Warrington Council has gone too far in its money-making schemes, and local councils should focus on delivering great services, and the way to achieve that is vote Conservative on the 2nd of May.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this year the government announced a further £600 million in extra funding for local councils. Real terms increase, as it has done every single year of this parliament. But we all know what happens when Labour are in charge, whether it is racking up debt in Warrington, as my honourable friend said, the 21% council tax increase in Labour-run Birmingham, or indeed slashing services in Nottingham, or as I just said, higher crime on average in each Labour Police and Crime Commissioner area. It's crystal clear, Mr. Speaker, that whenever Labour are in charge, it's working people that pay the price.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, while 64,000 people are on the waiting list for a council house in the West Midlands, families are living in hotels, in cold and damp homes and mouldy flats. The Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street, has built 46 social homes in 8 years. Does the Prime Minister think that is good enough?
Yes. Mr. Speaker, Andy Street is absolutely delivering for the West Midlands. Unlike the Labour mayor in London, he's delivered on all his housing targets, in fact. But it's the Labour-run council in Birmingham that's imposing on her constituents and others a 21% council tax rise. And what are they getting in exchange for that? 600 job losses, cuts to services, and on some streets, they're even turning off the lights, Mr. Speaker. I tell you, what Labour have done to Birmingham, the Conservatives will never let them do to Britain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I just ask the Prime Minister to thank his right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, for further meetings with Hitachi this morning, indeed with the union representatives. We're all glad to see what's happened with Alstom yesterday, but it's important that we do the same to support the factories up at Hitachi in Aycliffe.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for his role in championing the rail industry in the UK. As he rightly said, the Department for Transport and the Secretary of State have been actively engaged with companies to ensure we have a robust supply chain. And as he knows, we're investing record amounts in rail investment, particularly in the north, and we're pleased to see that that's being delivered.
Question, Nasha.
Speaker. The Prime Minister is no doubt aware of the collapse of SSB law, and many constituents, including hundreds in my constituency, have been affected and have bills of hundreds, up to hundreds of thousands. One constituent had to sell his wedding gifts, and his father had a heart attack with the stress. People are having to pay, literally raid their pension pots and getting bills and bailiffs knocking on the door. Will the Prime Minister meet with me and my constituents, representatives of the collapse of SSB law, and make sure the government responds to something that is an injustice that's happened to people across the country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to hear about the situation impacting the honourable lady's constituents. I'll be more than happy to make sure the right minister looks into it and we get back to her as soon as possible.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Right, the Chamber's now cleared. We now come to the urgent question. Shadow Secretary of State, David Lammy for...
Mr. Speaker, I ask an urgent question to ask the Secretary of State if he will make a statement on the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Deputy Foreign Secretary is regrettably unable to respond to this question in person, as he is in the World Bank Spring meetings in Washington. I will respond on his behalf. Earlier this month, we passed a grim milestone, 6 months since Hamas's horrific terrorist attack on Israel. The UK government has been working with partners across the region to secure the release of hostages, including British nationals. We want to see the release of all hostages. Palestinian civilians have spent these months suffering, with conditions worsening by the day. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire. The Iran attack and our support for Israel have not changed our focus on ensuring Israel meets its commitments to enable at least 500 aid trucks a day to enter Gaza, to open Ashdod port for aid deliveries, expand the Jordan land corridor, open a crossing into northern Gaza and extending hours at Kerem Shalom and at Nitzana. We're pushing as hard as we can to get aid to Palestinian civilians. And as this House knows, we've been urging Israel at the highest levels to take immediate action on the bottlenecks holding up humanitarian relief. We have recently seen a small increase in the number of aid trucks being allowed to enter Gaza, but not all of them are full. And numbers are not yet close to reaching the levels required, given the severity of the humanitarian situation we now see. We will continue to press Israel to take immediate action to open Ashdod fully for humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, we recently announced new support for a life-saving aid corridor by sea to Gaza, including the deployment of a Royal Navy ship, which has now arrived in the Mediterranean and is ready to integrate with the US pier and provide a command and control platform. We're also committing up to 9.7 million for aid deliveries through this corridor, as well as providing logistical expertise and equipment. In recent weeks, the Royal Air Force has conducted 7 airdrops along the Gazan coast, delivering more than 58 tons of food. And UK Meds Field Hospital, funded by the UK, is up and running in Gaza. It's treated more than 8,000 people already, a high proportion of them children. We need to see the operating environment within Gaza improve, so that as more aid gets in, it can be distributed quickly, safely, and effectively. Israel must ensure the UN has the access, equipment, and staff it needs to do this. We were horrified by the attack on the World Central Kitchen convoy, which killed 7 aid workers, including 3 very dedicated British nationals. Israel must do more to protect aid workers, including guaranteed deconfliction for aid convoys and other humanitarian work to ensure they can operate safely. The findings of Israel's investigation must be published in full and followed up with a wholly independent review to ensure the utmost transparency and accountability. 6 months on, Mr. Speaker, however much we might wish otherwise, the fighting has not yet come to an end. We cannot and will not stand by. The Foreign Secretary is in the region this week, pressing for further action.
Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lamb.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you for granting me this urgent question. Conditions in Gaza are desperate and intolerable. Famine is taking hold. There is sewage pooling in the streets. The water has still not been switched back on. Almost nothing is reaching northern Gaza, where people are already dying of starvation. The healthcare system has been utterly devastated. Yesterday, leading NGOs told me about specific blocks and restrictions they face from Israeli authorities in doing their life-saving work. Aid sat waiting, unable to reach those in need, some rotting where they stood. Items removed from trucks without explanation. Doctors are reusing single-use medical equipment from patients who have died. The UN report today said 10,000 women have been killed. Mr. Speaker, this is a description of hell on earth, and it cannot go on. For months, we've demanded that aid flow without restrictions, unfettered, unimpeded, at a level to meet humanitarian need. The UN Security Council has demanded it. The ICJ has ordered it. But despite the pledges made, UN figures show that there was more aid going in some days in January than there was yesterday. So I have 3 questions for the government. First, can the minister be clear that Israel is not meeting its commitments, and what pressure is the government applying to change that? Second, why has the government not yet announced it's restoring funding to UNRWA? It's shocking that in the face of famine, the UK is one of the last major donors that has not yet resumed funding without explanation. Third, why is the government seemingly softening its message to Netanyahu on Rafah? Let us be clear, 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering there have nowhere safe to go. Mr. Speaker, there can't be a humanitarian operation to meet the scale of need without an immediate ceasefire now. Both sides must agree to comply, and we note that it is Hamas and their leader Sinwar which rejected the latest ceasefire deal. They must urgently agree to end this war now. to prevent the further loss of innocent life, to free the hostages still cruelly held by Hamas, to allow a surge of aid into Gaza.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Important points have been made, and I think it's important to welcome that Israel's commitments to increase the amount of aid getting into Gaza and the limited steps that have been made. But, this is important, but more must be done, as the Right Honourable Gentleman was saying, to realise these commitments. And we continue to urge this. As I said, the Foreign Secretaries in the region, we're working hard on these issues. The Right Honourable Gentleman also talked about UNRWA. The final report from Kelowna is due at the end of April. We'll review that and then make a decision on the future funding. We do recognise the important role that UNRWA plays. And on the wider point, the more strategic point as well, in terms of our approach, it's very clear we want to see humanitarian pause and then push for the conditions for a sustainable ceasefire.
Sir Oliver Hill.
Right honourable friend, agree with me that the position of the hostages is absolutely key to this. And is he able to report any more progress? I mean, he's explained that Hamas have not agreed to the latest situation, but doesn't he agree with me that pressure needs to be put on them by their interlocutors who are working with them to really do something solid on the hostage problem and do it speedily?
The government continues to call for an immediate humanitarian pause, as we said, to allow for the release of hostages. While we cannot provide a running commentary on negotiations, which are highly sensitive and ongoing, the UK is using all of our diplomatic channels to support international negotiation efforts being facilitated by Egypt, Qatar and the US.
We come to SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Mr. Speaker, understandably, perhaps the world's attention has been on the shocking Iranian missile attack at the weekend, but we cannot and we must not forget about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the plight of millions of innocent civilians facing a man-made famine and living with the constant threat of attack. Neither can we forget those immensely brave humanitarian aid workers, particularly the 7 World Central Kitchen employees whose status as humanitarians appears to have offered them little or no protection from the IDF. And despite the promises made, the United Nations has reported that this week, more than 40% of what they tried to take into Gaza was rejected. And those of us who have been to the border and have seen the efforts of the Egyptian Red Crescent and their warehouse full of rejected medical equipment have a pretty good idea what those items were. And this is an area which has no single operational hospital. But the elephant in the room is arms export licences. And for how much longer is the UK going to send humanitarian aid to Gaza while simultaneously licensing weapons sales to Israel? And wouldn't the best form of humanitarian aid for the people of Gaza be to end supplying Israel with the weapons that will kill them?
The honourable gentleman is right to highlight what happened in Iran recently, and of course we mustn't forget the humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza. We're working very hard to make sure that aid can come through that he talked about. I highlighted that in my opening remarks. He also talked about exports. The latest assessment carried out by the Foreign Secretary leaves our position on export licences unchanged. This is consistent with the advice ministers have received, and we'll continue to keep this position under review. But he should remember his opening point about Iran and what's happened recently, and I'll leave it there on export controls.
Humanitarian aid getting into the Gaza Strip is very important. And has my right honourable friend noticed in that regard that the White House national security spokesman said in an interview with NBC in the last couple of days that aid getting into Gaza has increased by a large amount in the last few days. More than 2,000 trucks have been able to get in, about 100 trucks in the last 24 hours alone. 3 bakeries have reopened in northern Gaza in the past week, producing some 3 million pita breads daily, and food aid convoys are now continuing via the newly opened northern crossing. There's always more to do, of course, and as I said, it's very important. But will he accept that there are significant improvements, considering this is still an active war zone?
I'm grateful for the comments of my right honourable friend. As I said in my response to the opposition previously, sorry, can you just remember the question again? Sorry, on
Just about aid is improving.
Excuse me. Sorry. So we've seen a limited improvement. He says it's been significant, has, but from a low base. And clearly our aspirations are a lot higher, as I set out before. There are a number of key areas we want to see further improvements. We're working closely with Israel on that. Excuse me.
Select Committee Chair, Sarah Champion.
Minister, airdrops, promises of harbours, promises of money to come. These are not even touching the sides of the scale of the problem. People are starving to death.
Yes.
At the beginning of March, my committee published a report for the UK government to press for more than 500 trucks of humanitarian aid a day to be allowed into Gaza, for all of the crossings to open, for the Israeli military to cooperate better with aid agencies to deconfliction, so that humanitarian workers can live but also safely carry out their vital work. And despite the Foreign Secretary's optimism of greater humanitarian flows, the weekly average is just over 1,100 trucks a week. Why is this government not doing more to persuade Israel to meet its responsibilities under international law and facilitate the aid to the people to Gaza? How many more people have to die?
Minister.
I understand the honourable member's concerns, particularly in her position as chair of the Select Committee, but I have highlighted already that we are pressing incredibly hard with Israel. We are pressing incredibly hard with Israel to make further progress. There has been limited progress, but the Foreign Secretary is in the region and he continues to press for these cases, as does my right honourable friend, the Minister for Development, who's doing important work in this area as well.
Maltese.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to question the Minister again on the same theme, but he will start to appreciate the frustration in the House that over the last 6 months, we've heard the government beg, plead, press, have telephone calls, meetings, have conversations, even the RAF in the sky to rightly defend Israel from Iran. And yet it's occurring to many of us that the Israeli government cares little for what we say, to the extent that medical aid for Palestinians now report that a famine is all but inevitable over the next few weeks in Gaza. When are we going to realise that saying things is making no difference, and we actually have to act, not least to take steps to enforce the judgment of the International Court of Justice? When will we actually do something concrete to save these lives?
Minister.
As I said, we are pressing incredibly hard to make sure that we see further progress in this vital area. And as I highlighted before, one of the key things that we're doing is committing 9.7 million for aid deliveries through the life-saving aid corridor by sea to Gaza. This is a material step. This is action that's being taken. But clearly, we will continue to put pressure on the Israelis. They've made commitments. We want them to stand up and realise, or allow agencies to realise those commitments.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Crossings are still not open. Trucks are going in half empty. 41% of requests from the UN to send in aid to northern Gaza are being refused by the Israeli government. That's the reality on the ground. The Colonna report comes out this Saturday, the 20th of April, not the end of the month. When will the government come to this House to tell us when it will reinstate funding to UNRWA, the only aid organisation with the infrastructure on the ground to deliver aid at scale?
As I said, we will be reviewing that report, and when we've received it, we'll make our final decision. We'll come and explain to Parliament what that decision is. And as I also highlighted, and more importantly, as the Development Minister's highlighted, we recognise the vital role that UNRWA plays.
Manchester.
Speaker, the Foreign Secretary was very proud to announce that the United Kingdom has set up a contact group for the Middle East, which has members from Europe, it has from the Middle East and the United States. A key part of that link to the humanitarian situation in Palestine and Gaza is this.
The European Commission and some of those members, all those members, have decided to fund UNRWA. They have, and they're part of the contact group to find a solution to the Middle East. And therefore, why is it taking us so long when our European counterparts have made that decision? And linked to that, I asked the Minister to ask the Foreign Secretary, I raised it with him and the Prime Minister to set up an international donors conference for Palestine. We did it with Friends of Syria. We now need to urgently move forward and show our leadership in this matter as the situation is getting very, very, very critical.
Minister.
As I said, I'll say it again, we wait for the final colonial report before we make the decision on UNRWA. The situation around this was particularly concerning, so we need that report to make the decision. And my honourable friend will remember that we have also trebled the amount of aid that we provided to occupied Palestinian territories, and now our task is to make sure that we can and find ways to get that aid in.
Leila Moran.
Yesterday, Oxford doctors Nick Maynard and Deborah Harrington briefed parliamentarians very movingly about their experiences of treating people in Gaza. They impressed on us how important it was that they were kept safe, how many of their colleagues had died, and I'm sure the Minister and the whole House will thank them for their tireless work, and other aid workers and anyone who gives over their safety to save others. They also pointed out that the malnutrition that we are seeing now is making patients more vulnerable to infectious disease. And there is a report released by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine that has projected that if it continues as it is, 74,000 excess deaths, that's beyond those who have died by bombs, will die if something isn't done. So will the Minister agree with me that the only thing that needs to happen now is that immediate bilateral ceasefire, but also a rebuilding of the medical situation in Gaza now, not later, because that is what's stopping people from getting the life-saving treatment they desperately need.
Minister.
I join her in praising the vital work of aid workers in the most challenging of circumstances and highlight the courage and bravery that they demonstrate. And obviously we want to make sure that we create the conditions in which they can operate more safely. She calls for a ceasefire. We call for a pause that can lead to a sustainable ceasefire, which will enable that to happen. And of course, as we move to that situation, then some of the issues she talked about, particularly around providing that extra medical support, can be provided.
Thanks
very much, Mr. Speaker. Access to the north of Gaza for humanitarian aid is still dire. 28 children reported to have died of malnutrition and dehydration. UNRWA continues to be disproportionately affected by access restrictions and was last able to deliver food to northern Gaza at the end of January. Other countries, as we've heard, are restoring funding to UNRWA, including the United States. So why are we taking so long?
Minister.
We want to see the report and we'll make our final decision. We recognise the important role of UNRWA. We also recognise the importance of opening a crossing in northern Gaza, which she highlighted in her opening point. And we are pressing Israel to make sure that they stand up to their commitments.
Richard Burgon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I attended a meeting of British doctors who recently been in Gaza, and they described the systematic targeting of healthcare in Gaza. Let's be clear, that is a war crime. A UN Special Rapporteur recently warned a meeting of MPs organised that government ministers and officials involved in arms exports to Israel should be absolutely clear that they could be individually criminally liable for aiding and abetting war crimes in Gaza. So will the minister say, on the record, in this House and ahead of next week's High Court hearing, that the legal advice the government has received has confirmed that there is no such risk and that arms sales are in line with international law?
Minister.
These assessments we've made on our position on export licences remain unchanged, and this is consistent with the advice that ministers have received. We'll continue to keep this position under review.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As was referenced earlier, our close allies in the United States have commended Israel for stepping up the amount of aid getting into Gaza. Yet once those aid trucks are on the Gazan side of the border, Hamas has sought to hijack the trucks and seek to cynically use the distribution of aid as a political weapon, as recognised by this government. So can I ask my right honourable friend what assessment he has made of the level of control exercised by Hamas on UNRWA and the distribution of aid?
He makes important points, and that's why we're waiting for this final report, as I've said repeatedly, so we can make a final decision. The underlying situation relating to UNRWA was very, very challenging, and we need to make sure this aid is used for the appropriate purposes. He makes a very important point.
Absolutely.
The government rightly condemned Iran for risking destabilization in the region and demonstrating intent on sowing chaos in its own backyard. Yet we have had 6 months of Israel killing civilians, doctors, and aid workers, destroying almost all civilian infrastructure in Gaza, cutting off water, fuel, and electricity, and severely limiting the supply of aid. This is all in clear violation of international law, has destabilized the region, and sown chaos in Israel's own backyard. So will the minister condemn the action of Israel then too?
Minister.
Look, we recognise that Israel has the right to defend itself, and we're calling for an immediate pause to get aid in and get the hostages out, as we said. We also recognise the destabilising action of Iran and its acolytes, and we have to make sure we push back and seek to de-escalate the whole situation.
Speaker, by now there could be a humanitarian pause. Aid could be flowing into Gaza to help those poor individuals who are threatened with famine and the war. But of course, just as the last humanitarian pause was breached by Hamas, Hamas refused to accept having a ceasefire on the terms that have been agreed. That could mean that the hostages could be coming back now. That could mean that the people of Gaza could be receiving the aid. Does he agree with me that Hamas are clearly the obstacle to peace in the Middle East?
Minister.
Clearly, Hamas are an obstacle to peace. Their actions provoked terrible atrocities in Israel back in October, and we find that abhorrent. We do now, though, want to make sure that we can find a way of tackling these terrible humanitarian situations, as I've described, and find a way to destabilize, to tackling destabilizing activity, further destabilizing activity by Iran.
Williams.
Mr. Speaker, replying to my written question on the 15th of April, the Minister said, "We want UNRWA to give detailed undertakings about changes in personnel, policy and precedents." Has the Minister or any of his other colleagues actively sought these undertakings and changes from UNRWA by contacting them directly? And if so, on what date was that request last made?
Minister.
The broader issue about UNRWA, obviously, is we're waiting for this final report, and then we can make decisions on the detailed points he's made. I'll raise them with the Development Minister and get back to him.
Nigel Bills.
On the UNRWA funding issue again, would the Minister confirm that it is inconceivable that the money we would earmark for them will not be given this year? So could he either set out what alternative agencies he think on the ground could do the same work and achieve the same outcomes, or would he just confirm we're going to have to give them the money anyway, so we may as well get on with it?
Minister.
Look, I've already said that UNRWA do and carry out important work and have a vital role, but the situation, the concerns around their activities mean that we have to have this report, and we want to then look at our approach and our funding in relation to it.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oxfam has reported that 1.1 million people are projected to be facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity in Gaza, and children are now starving. Samantha Power, Administrator of USAID, told US Congress last week that northern Gaza is now experiencing famine. Does the government share that assessment, and how will aid get there?
Minister.
We continue to be very concerned about the humanitarian challenges that are in place in Gaza. And as I've highlighted to the House, we are pressing really hard. We're taking steps ourselves. We've increased the amount of aid that we're committing to the region, and we're focusing laser-like to seek Israel to step up to the commitments they've made. They've already made some limited progress. We need to see more.
Jameson.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Israel's right to self-defence comes with clear responsibility. Gaza has become a conflict hellhole, and the delivery of more humanitarian aid from the international community, including the UN, is non-discretionary. But could the Minister please confirm to the House that everything possible is being done with the Israeli government to ensure that non-combatants are being supported and are not being inadvertently targeted or hit?
We've highlighted this with the Israeli government, and I can confirm to my honourable friend that we are pushing incredibly hard. Not only are we increasing the amount of aid that we've given to the region, highlighted to the region, but we want to make sure that that gets through as well. And we've already deployed a number of airdrops which have helped, but there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has been said, over 33,000 killed, 70% of whom are women and children. The ICJ has warned of a genocide, and more than 1 million are left starving, while almost 2 million are displaced from their homes. Yet, even as the Foreign Office's own legal advice, which they continually refuse to make public, is purported to declare that the Israeli military are breaking international law, and the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, the reality remains nothing has changed. The bombs are still falling, the children are still starving, and the civilians are still dying. So let me ask the Minister a very simple question. Does international humanitarian law even mean anything anymore when the UK and international community continue to refuse to draw a line?
I understand the passion, I understand his concern about the area, but we continue to have grave concerns about the humanitarian access as well. But this is not sufficient to undermine our judgment that Israel is committed to complying with IHL in general.
Israel's military is reported to be using lavender, an artificial intelligence system, to help choose its bombing targets in Gaza. This is machine decision-making over human decision-making and arguably sacrifices accuracy in favour of speed. The lavender system identifies targets which are only reviewed for 20 seconds before authorisation of a strike. What discussions has the Minister had with MOD colleagues about the use of AI in combat, the concerns over error rates and the humanitarian impact on the ground?
Minister.
Too many civilians have been killed, and we want to see Israel take greater care to limit its operations to military targets and avoid harming civilians and destroying homes. That's the message we give to the Israeli government when we engage with them.
John MacDonald.
The situation in Gaza is having its impact on the West Bank. Tragically, this week, a 14-year-old Israeli child was found dead, and that set off a process of settlers rampaging across the West Bank. We now know that 4 Palestinians have been killed and others brutally attacked. The evidence is that the IDF soldiers stood to one side and allowed that to happen. And meeting with Israeli colleagues this morning, we hear that the Israeli government now is arresting legal and peace observers from the West Bank. Could the government now make it very, very clear to the Israeli government that observers should be allowed to operate within the West Bank to ensure that peace is maintained, but also could we have a report now in detail on the sanctions that the government is applying to Israeli settlements and Israeli settlers?
Minister.
I don't know the detail of some of the earlier points that he made. I'll welcome receiving that. But in terms of the sanctions, we put them in place. My understanding and memory is that on 2 individuals, we keep this under review constantly, because those actions and what happens in the settlements are important, and the implications it has for the West Bank.
Hammer.
Thank you very much. The escalation of recent days has been deeply worrying. We have 2 nuclear-armed countries exchanging ballistics, and neither with any reputation for care about civilian lives, and both with agendas of their own. That escalation has occupied the headlines, but the people of Gaza continue to suffer unrelenting military attacks and starvation. The rules-based order and international law have suffered lasting damage, including by the targeting of aid workers and medics. The UK's influence with an out-of-control Netanyahu government has yielded very little. One of the few legal tools available is the suspension of arms export licences. When will the government use that?
Minister.
As I said in previous answer, our assessment on export license remain unchanged. We've got one of the world's most robust export systems in the world, enshrined in law through the Export Control Act and implemented through our strategic export licensing criteria. I think it's really important that she recalls and notes not just the humanitarian situation in Gaza, but also what's happening through Iran's destabilizing activities as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Humanitarian agencies have concluded that we have passed the point of being able to avert famine in Gaza. Whatever we do now, it will be too late for those people who have starved to death by the time the aid arrives. That is a stain on the international community. Can the Minister update the House on what specific steps this government has taken to bring about the full implementation of Resolution 2728 passed by the UN Security Council over 3 weeks ago? Pleading, pressuring, pressing the Israeli government clearly is not a strategy that is working. So why doesn't the UK government recognise that consequences and concrete actions can start with the stopping of arms sales to Israel?
Minister.
We are urging, we're pleading, we're doing everything that we can. We're doing everything that we can to make our case. And we're also tripling the amount of aid that we have to 100 million. And, as I said as well, we're taking action to have this life-saving aid corridor by sea to Gaza. These are important actions that we're taking forward.
Father Lockhart.
Thank you. Having seen the drone attacks in Israel at the weekend, it is disappointing to watch the government and US administration basically telling the Israelis to roll over and accept this aggression by Iran. It was, however, encouraging to see an alliance of air forces assist the Israelis to protect their people. I do wonder why there is little condemnation of this aggression against Israel and continued acknowledgement. Had October the 7th never happened, there would be none of this happening. Therefore, what is this government doing to ensure both Gazans and Israelis are free from Hamas and Iranian aggression respectively and can live normal lives? And as we say in the UK, Israel has the right to defend itself.
Minister.
I agree, the government agrees that Israel does have the right to defend itself. And as part of our approach to finding and putting in place, enabling to put in place a sustainable ceasefire, the role of Hamas has to be put clearly in place. It must not have the influence it has at the moment, and its ability to fire rockets into Israel will need to be completely diminished to enable that sustainable ceasefire to take action.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will know his words are not cutting through. What Hamas was wrong to reject the ceasefire, but what Israel does next is not inevitable. And yet the Minister for Defence on Monday evening said that they were waiting for aid to be delivered to Rafah and for civilians to leave, and then they would begin the military operation. He will know there is nowhere for these people to go, and there is no food elsewhere. It is an impossible choice for people. A few pita breads will not cut it for millions of people at risk of starvation and at risk of harm from a military operation in Rafah. So what will the UK do if Israel proceeds with its threat to enter Rafah?
Minister.
As the honourable member knows, I respect her enormously, and we've worked together on a number of issues. All I would just say on this, vitally important, is that we want to urge restraint about this proposed military operation by the Israelis. We are also calling for restraint in response to what's happened with Iran, although notably the RAF and others were there to provide support to defend Israel from that attack from Iran. So the Foreign Secretary is in Israel, is in the region this week to tackle these very issues and address the points that I've made.
Marshal Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, in response to my question about restoring UNRWA funding, the Prime Minister said that, along with allies, he was reviewing the interim findings. In subsequent responses to other honourable members, he said he was waiting for a final report, now which was due at the end of April. We know that this report is due on the 20th. Can we have a government statement on Monday where the government sets out a clear pathway back to restoring funding? The UK is the only major donor, aside from the United States, that have not restored their funding. Time is running out and lives are being lost.
I recognise the importance of the point she's made, and all I would say, as I've said previously, we're waiting for the report, and then we will update Parliament on our decision. We need to review this report in detail.
George Galloway.
17 repetitions of "we're waiting for the report" will become the new definition of complacency. The more I listen, Mr. Speaker, to both front benches describing the bloody, putrid sea of misery that is Gaza, the more I was amazed that both of them continue to support the supply of British arms and military components to the country that's doing all this. No one could understand that. And the more he said how hard they were trying, and personally I believe him, seems a sincere chap, but why isn't it working? If you're trying so hard while scrambling your jets to defend Israel, giving arms to Israel, why won't they listen to you?
All I say with respect is that the questions that have been asked to me, I think, are entirely appropriate and understandable given the circumstances. I've responded as best I can from the government's perspective. I think the honourable gentleman knows from his extensive experience that the situation on the ground is hugely, hugely complex. We're working night and day. Our officials in SCDO are working flat out. We're providing the support we can for Israel and to help tackle the destabilisation. So I understand the passion that he asked these questions for, but he should also understand these are incredibly complex situations. We're endeavouring to do everything we can with Israel to make our case, but they are also having to think about the implications of what's happening and act after a terrible, tragic attack by Hamas and responses by Iran as well.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm concerned to hear from the Minister that the allegations that have been made by several organisations that the trucks are half full or less going in makes counting the amount of aid getting into Gaza by truck a difficult statistic to use. Can I ask the Minister what he's doing to ensure that tonnage of aid is getting to the right places? Because quite clearly, Israel authorities seem to not be able to deliver on their duties under international law to get aid to the right places. And what more can the Minister do to put pressure on Israeli authorities to do what is legally binding and right to do?
Minister. So it's an important point. We need to not just think about the trucks, but the tonnage as well. I will speak to Minister Mitchell, the Development Minister on this particular issue as well, and make sure we have extra focus on it. We do need the trucks, we do need the tonnage as well. It's vitally important.
Newland.
Mr. Speaker, it's good to finally hear the Labour front bench seemingly find its voice on this issue after months and tens of thousands of deaths of shameful prevarication, yet still willing to potentially sell Israeli arms. And on the UK government's policy, own policy regarding sales, the criteria for halting arms sales does not require a legal confirmation that breaches of international humanitarian law has occurred, only that it might have occurred. Does the Minister not consider the ongoing investigation by the ICC of war crimes and crimes against humanity and the consideration by the ICJ of potential genocide as an indication that breaches of international law might have occurred? And in any event, why would we be so keen to sell arms to someone we've been pressing so hard to cease operations?
We continue to have grave concerns about the humanitarian situation on the ground, but this is not sufficient to undermine our judgment that Israel is committed to comply with IHL in general. And we've already talked at length about the export licenses and our controls around that. We do recognise that Israel has the right to defend itself.
Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Belgian Foreign Minister stated Israel was engaging in tactics of starvation. Last month, the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Ireland stated the use of starvation as a weapon of war is a blatant violation of international humanitarian law. This month, Belgium's Minister of Development Cooperation stated Israel's use of hunger as a weapon of war was a flagrant violation of international law. The Israeli Defense Minister was on record as saying, I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. When will this government wake up to the reality that innocent Palestinians are dying and take actions to stop them from dying from hunger and starvation?
We're working hard to get the aid in, as I've already highlighted. That's absolutely critical. And we're also calling out the Israeli government to make sure that, recognising that too many civilians have been killed, we want to see Israel take greater care to limit its operation to the military targets and avoid harming the civilians and destroying homes, as he's indicated.
Coram Buck.
Well, I think the world is astounded by the fact that we are having to rely upon sea corridors and airdrops for the delivery of aid when we know that the only way that we will prevent starvation in the hell that is Gaza is through mass truck supply and an UNRWA-assisted delivery. Can the Minister explain to us the government's assessment of whether the current supply of aid through trucks, air and sea is sufficient to prevent imminent famine?
Minister.
We've seen limited improvements. I've highlighted that already, but we want to see Israel stand up to its commitment to increase the total number of aid trucks to at least 500 a day and increasing the capacity through the Jordan land corridor to 100 trucks a day. So there's clearly more work that's required. And it's important to highlight as well, it's not just us, this is an international priority where we're working with our other partners.
Tamsing Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Given the horrific scale of killing and the starvation of Palestinians, especially children, we need an immediate ceasefire, release of hostages, and the Netanyahu government must allow unimpeded aid into Gaza rather than continually blocking it. However, there also needs to be a process of investigation, accountability, and justice, given the serious allegations of war crimes, whether that's through the ICC, the ICJ, or the UN Commission of Inquiry. But the UK government presently doesn't find any of these routes acceptable. So for the record, Minister, could he please highlight which of these accountability mechanisms does the UK Conservative government find acceptable?
We respect the role and the independence of the ICJ, but our view is that Israel's actions in Gaza cannot be described as genocide or the points that he's been raising. And we're also remain clear that formal determination of genocide should be based upon the final judgment by a competent court.
Deirdre Black.
Mr. Speaker, could he just explain to me the rationale, this is something that's puzzled me for some time, behind advocating a humanitarian pause in the bombing, allowing medical aid, food, water, basic supplies into Gaza, and then presumably just permitting the killing to start up again? I mean, bombing civilians is a crime against humanity. Isn't it time for humanity to be reasserted here and for the immediate ceasefire that so many have called for to be started now?
Our position, the government's position, is that we need a pause. We need to get aid in, we need to get hostages out, and then work for the conditions for a lasting peace. And we have to recognise Hamas's role in getting to this point as well. And in that, in those conditions, we need to remove Hamas's capacity to launch attacks against Israel and make sure that it's no longer in charge in Gaza.
That's sharp.
Can I just say thank you to my constituents who organised a gathering for the Palestinians in the north in my constituency this weekend for Eid gathering, which I attended, and there I met Palestinian Gaza health aid workers, and I heard lots of stories, and one of them, similar to the one which is a lady who had given birth to triplets, Nuzza Awan, Awad, her babies should have weighed approximately 6 to 8 pounds each, but actually they weighed just 2 pounds each, and they haven't even developed their thighs because of malnutrition. Now, we know that 27 children have died so far, according to confirmed reports of malnutrition. We send the RAF jets in to support Israel when they are attacked, yet Israel does not heed the British government's warnings to get humanitarian aid in. So rightfully, people are asking, why is our government so weak when it concerns saving the lives of children?
Minister.
Some of the points you've made are absolutely tragic. It's heartrending to hear. But I just want to reiterate that we do want to see change. We're pushing for change, and we're taking the action to make sure there's more aid available. We just need to get those conditions now to enable the aid to come forward and get through to the people that need it on the ground in Gaza.
Mr. Speaker, I was a bigger pardon, not standing. Will the ministers say why it is when the Israeli government is not listening to him about aid getting in, that the government are still considering selling arms to Israel? It cannot be the case that we are pleading with them so much that the government then accepts that situation and continues to sell those arms.
We're working hard with the Israeli government on humanitarian issues, which I've highlighted. Our export controls are in place and our approach remains unchanged. We do have to recognise that Israel does have the right to defend itself.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister says the government recognises the importance of opening a northern crossing, but as my right little friend on the front bench said earlier, almost no aid is entering northern Gaza. The situation there is most desperate, in a desperate situation everywhere. Just what pressure, exactly what pressure is the government applying to ensure that routes to northern Gaza become operational as soon as possible and remain open?
Minister. It's part of our ongoing diplomatic efforts with Israel and with our like-minded partners as well, who are committed to providing aid to get that in. And one of the key things that Israel's committed to is to that northern route. She makes that point very importantly, and that is one of those elements that we're continuing to urge Israel to stand up and commit to.
F-35s are reducing Gaza to dust. During Pinochet's brutal rule in Chile, the workers of Rolls-Royce and East Kilbride refused to manufacture parts for the Chilean Air Force and were hailed as heroes. Why? Why will this UK government not follow that humanitarian example and stop exporting the parts for F-35s?
It's because we've got one of the most robust arms export regimes in the world. And as I said, we need to recognise Israel's right to defend itself. He probably noticed what happened over the weekend with the attacks from Iran. These are not just important for what happens in Israel, vitally important that is, and for those involved in Gaza. This situation has ripple-out effects that destabilise in the region, have global implications as well.
Ian Bell. We were told a month ago that 1.1 million people face catastrophic levels of food insecurity in Gaza, and we're reduced to airdrops. The situation in northern Gaza is horrific, and it's a consequence of political choices. The World Food Programme has said the series largely being cut off from aid, and because of the highest levels of catastrophic hunger in the world, 28 innocent children reported to have died of malnutrition and dehydration because of political choices. What meaningful, strong actions will the government take to ensure international law is upheld and to ensure that all Palestinians have a right to food?
Well, I think I've highlighted already the steps that we're taking. We also highlighted the commitments that Israel have made, and that's what we're asking Israel to do, is to step up to its commitments. It's made limited progress. We want to see much further progress to help those people on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to UNICEF, one child in Gaza is killed or injured on average every 10 minutes. Yesterday, Israeli occupying forces struck a playground in the Maghazi refugee camp in central Gaza, massacring at least 11 people and injuring many more. The Deputy Foreign Secretary has boasted about how proud his government is to be supplying Israel with arms, even while it commits such crimes against humanity and has been found by the ICJ to be plausibly committing genocide against the Palestinian people. So can the Minister tell us categorically whether or not arms exported from Britain were used in the strike on the Benghazi refugee camp, and for that matter, whether the three British aid workers who were killed at the beginning of the month were killed by weapons manufactured in Britain?
As already highlighted, we have strong export controls, and the point that he makes, an important point, is we've asked Israel for a assessment and an investigation to take place, and an independent investigation to take place as to what happened in that situation.
Deborah Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue to call for the immediate release of all hostages, for an immediate ceasefire, unhindered humanitarian aid, adherence to international law and accountability for any breaches, and immediate international efforts for a two-state solution. But on aid and on international law, between the 6th and 12th of April, 41% of UN-coordinated missions to northern Gaza, where famine is underway and children are dying by the minute. And the obligation the Israeli authorities have to facilitate humanitarian war is a matter of law. It's not just about access, they have to get to where it's needed. I appreciate the difficulties the Minister has found himself in today, but I push again on why the government is so ineffective in getting support. We've had months upon months of saying that things are going to happen, and it never has. Why have they been so ineffective? And what are they going to do to make sure Israel adheres to our requests?
Minister.
I've highlighted that there has been limited progress, so that we have made some progress in our arguments, along with international partners with Israel. And now we're pressing for those other areas to be dealt with, including northern access. It's a vital priority, and we're pushing hard. And as I said, the Foreign Secretary is once again in the region this week to address these issues.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last week, Samantha Power of US Aid told Congress that they were witnessing famine in northern Gaza. Let's be honest here. To the wider global population, it appears Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war, whether it be the supply into the country or intimidating and killing those workers who should be distributing it. So does he share the US assessment of the situation, and will he commit to supporting and restoring the funding of UNRWA?
Minister.
We remain concerned about the implications and the targeting of civilians. Too many have been killed, and we want Israel to make sure they take greater care to limit its operations to military targets. And as I said repeatedly, we await this report from Kelowna about the UNRWA situation, and then we can examine our response.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Some 500 healthcare workers have been killed in Gaza in the past 6 months. That's more than the total number of healthcare workers killed in all conflicts around the world in the previous 2 years. Does the Minister agree with Professor Nick Maynard, the British surgeon recently returned from Gaza, that healthcare workers are being deliberately targeted? And if so, why is the UK still supplying arms to Israel?
Minister.
I've addressed the point about arms, but I think it's important, the point he makes about protecting aid workers, and we believe they need to do much more to protect them, and that includes the guaranteed deconfliction of aid convoys and other humanitarian work to ensure that they can operate safely.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I've heard the Minister repeatedly, in answer to questions, talk about pressure on Israel, encouraging Israel, a hope that Israel will respond. When will he actually stand at the dispatch box and accept that for all the government's urging and encouraging, the situation's actually getting worse? So what is he going to say in concrete terms that the government is going to do now to get aid through, to make sure Israel lives up to the promise it makes and doesn't deliver on. And just additionally to that point, please don't give me an answer about the strength of our arms sales license regime. How can it be morally right to provide arms to Israel being used in the killing of women and children and worsening the humanitarian crisis?
Minister.
As I've highlighted, we've trebled the amount of aid that we are putting into to support those people. We recognise as well that Israel is an occupying power, so we have to work with them to enable these things to happen. And the important thing is we are seeing limited progress, and as I've said, now we're pushing and pressing to see further progress in achieving the aims and the commitments that Israel's already set out.
Chiomura.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister, I hope, remembers Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old Palestinian girl who was trapped in a car with nothing but a mobile phone, her own cries for help, and a paramedic queue struggling to get to her. They and Hind were all killed that day. An IDF investigation concluded that its forces were not present near the vehicle within firing range. A subsequent Washington Post investigation disagrees. I raise that case, Madam Deputy Speaker, to remember Hind, but also because whenever the Israeli Defense Forces' actions result in increased civilian suffering or reduced humanitarian aid, as in the killing of aid workers, the government's response is to call on Israel to investigate itself. Is that really the only way to ensure accountability and reduce suffering?
On the specific point about aid workers, I did highlight that we also want to have an independent review as well. It's really important that they're protected. We need to understand the situation that happened on the ground. And she highlights, importantly, that we are also urging Israel to take greater care in limiting its operations and the impact it has on civilians.
Jonathan Edwards.
Madam Deputy Speaker, following the Iranian attacks of the weekend, we are one step away from the precipice of a regional war. And the comments of the Foreign Secretary this afternoon following his meetings with the Israeli government that he believes Israel is minded to act should worry us all. The British government rightly emphasised the need for de-escalation, but does it recognise that de-escalation must begin in Gaza?
Minister.
We need to de-escalate the whole situation and do everything we can to use our influence in that task. We've highlighted already what we're asking Israel to do and urging them to do as a humanitarian perspective in terms of their stated aims to carry out further military action in Rafah. And then there's the wider area as well. So we're working along with our partners in the region, around the world, to find ways to de-escalate the situation more widely. It is multifaceted, really complicated, but we're finding ways to bring that influence to bear because we do not want this to escalate any further.
Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Every member of this House knows that it was that great conservative statesman who said that all it takes for evil to prevail is for good people to stand by and do nothing. Today, the minister has, and he's a good man, we know that. He must have been embarrassed. He stood there, he's wrung his hands, and he's told us that the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, has pleaded with the Israeli Prime Minister. When did the party of Edmund Burke become the party of complicity and appeasement?
Minister.
I'm not really sure that question deserves an answer, to be honest. Look, we've already highlighted cross-party. These situations are complex. We're working incredibly hard with all our partners. I think that's recognised by the opposition front bench as well. Of course, it's challenging, but please don't look at the tone that way.
Alan Bryan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, so 1.1 million civilians in Gaza are currently at risk of starvation due to Israeli aid blockade. It's clearly a breach of humanitarian law and a breach of interim ICJ ruling. Now, the UK government actually tacitly recognises the breaches because they're trying to bypass the Israeli blockade using the Royal Navy. But the UK government's incoherent position is rather than call out Israel,
The Minister says you're urging and pleading Israel to change tack while still selling arms to Israel and withholding funding to UNRWA. Now, the interim Kelowna report confirms UNRWA's neutrality. All other major donors, apart from the US, have restored funding. So what is it that's making UK government wait in the final Kelowna report before restoring funding? Are they sitting intelligence that's somehow not available to all these other partners?
Yeah. Minister.
We've made it clear that we want to see the full report and then we'll make a decision.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Between the 6th and the 12th of April, 41% of UN coordinated aid missions to northern Gaza were impeded or denied access. The Israeli authorities' obligation to facilitate humanitarian support is not just about getting trucks in, it's about getting aid to where it's actually needed. That is a matter of international humanitarian law. So does he really think that less than 60% getting in is an acceptable rate? And does it really show the government's diplomatic efforts to be successful?
Minister.
We're seeing some success enabling and encouraging Israel to allow more of these trucks in. And as I said, it's limited progress, but it is progress. But clearly there's a lot more that needs to be done. And we're working with our partners to make sure we can do that.
Carol Monaghan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, testimony from an Israeli intelligence officer reveals that IDF soldiers were authorised to kill 20 uninvolved civilians for a single Hamas operative. Israel is frequently in breach of the principle of proportionality, and frankly, UK diplomacy is not working. So what will it take for the government to finally admit that Israel is breaching international humanitarian law and cease arms sales?
Minister.
We talked about this a number of times in this urgent question and our responses. I'm just about to answer that particular question. Thanks for the encouragement there. We have grave concerns about the humanitarian access, but this is not sufficient to undermine our judgment that Israel is committed to complying with IHL in general.
James Murray.
Last week, Samantha Power, the Administrator of USAID, told Congress that northern Gaza is now experiencing famine. Almost no aid is entering northern Gaza. So does the Minister agree this situation is intolerable and unacceptable? And what exactly is the government doing to make sure it changes urgently?
Minister.
Yeah, the situation is incredibly challenging. And one of the things, I've said it already in answer to one of the earlier questions, is that in the commitments that Israel have made, one of them is about access in the north, and that's what we continue to urge Israel to now live up to its commitments so that aid can come in from the north, as well as more aid more generally into help those on the ground in Gaza.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Jim Henderson from Cornwall served in the Royal Marines for 7 years before working in Gaza. He and the aid convoy that was travelling from the north that he was supporting, they were following the right procedures and they remained on the correct route. It is understandable that the death of Jim and his fellow Brits should have seized our attention here at home and led to an investigation by the IDF. But the Secretary-General said a fortnight ago the death of all 196 aid workers killed in Gaza in the last 6 months should be subject to independent investigations. Does he agree?
Minister.
I've already highlighted how important it is that we urge Israel to do much more to protect aid workers. We want to make sure that there are guaranteed deconfliction of aid convoys, and we need to do other humanitarian work to help. And I want to pay tribute to those individuals who've done heroic work, including those that he highlighted. I think the honourable member will recognise that that individual he referred to as a constituent of my honourable friend, the member for Truro and Falmouth, who's been working, as I understand it, closely with their families. And I'm grateful to her for that.
Michael Shanks.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister on a number of occasions today has said how complex the humanitarian situation is on the ground. UNRWA is the aid agency with most of the logistical and organisational network to deliver that. On Monday, the Prime Minister was asked a number of times around the interim report that he says the government has received. Will the Minister commit to publishing that in full, and the discussions that he says he's having with allies on what should happen next, will those be published so that we know what it is that's holding back the UK from being the last country not to fund UNRWA?
The thing that's holding us back from being signing off our approach is seeing the report. That's what we need to wait for. It's coming very, very soon, and we will be responding to that in full.
Alison Thewlis.
The Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, has talked about the devastating destruction of Gaza's hospitals, including the dead bodies still being removed to the ruins of Al-Shifa. Will the United Kingdom fund the World Health Organization and other charities on the ground in Gaza to rebuild the shattered hospitals that have been destroyed under Israeli bombardment? And will he deliver the ceasefire necessary to allow this construction to happen? Because that cannot happen while there is no construction materials going into Gaza.
She makes a characteristically thoughtful point, and an important one about reconstruction. I think our immediate approach now is about the pause, getting aid in. That's got to be the top priority right now. Then as we look forward, let's get those conditions in place to have a sustainable ceasefire. And as part of that, we can work through how that construction or reconstruction would take place.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you. As I said to the Prime Minister in his statement on Monday, the mother of James Kirby, one of the other aid workers who lost his life while trying to deliver aid through World Central Kitchen, is my constituent, and the family want answers, and I would really appreciate it if the Minister could tell the Foreign Secretary while he's in the region, you pass that message on from the family. They want answers. Yeah. But given what he said about guaranteed deconfliction and what we've heard from my honourable friend here about the attacks on care workers, as well as the attacks on people trying to deliver food aid, can he explain to me what these pleas for guaranteed deconfliction actually mean? Because I just don't see that it's working.
Yeah. Minister.
Well, it's. I'd also just like to pay tribute, as she has, to James Kirby, and our thoughts are clearly and our prayers are with his family. The work that we're doing to raise this point with Israel is important, and we want to find ways to make sure that we deconflict these aid convoys. I think Israel has recognised that there are challenges there. They're going to be carrying out their own report, and there needs to be this further independent review that can help find ways to make sure that this deconfliction can be meaningful and strong.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Minister very much for his response to all the questions. It's quite clear the Minister is a Minister with compassion, and he wants to answer in the best way, and we thank him for that. I had an occasion last week, Madam Deputy Speaker, to be in Israel. I had occasion to visit some of the kibbutz where innocent Jewish people were murdered. I had occasion to visit the Nova musical festival where over 1,000 young people were murdered as well. And I had occasion to meet some of the families. All of that as a result of Hamas terrorism upon the Israeli people. The reason why we have got a humanitarian crisis in Gaza is because of Hamas. So can the Minister confirm what discussions have taken place to open wider channels to allow medical aid in and to allow ill people to come out to have medical interventions free from harassment and intervention from Hamas?
I thank the Honourable Member for Strangford for his comments, and I regard him as a very good friend. He's right to highlight the role of Hamas and what they've done to get to this situation. And now we are working collectively to figure out how we can best address the situations. Medical supplies are key. We will be providing those. We're providing support in terms of shelter. We've been helping with airdrops. We know there's more that needs to be done. That's clear across the House. There's frustration in this task, and I'm grateful to all the colleagues here across the House for, on most of the occasions, measured comments, and I understand their concerns. I'm also pleased that people haven't resorted to cheap party politics here. These are incredibly difficult challenges, and I'm very grateful for the questions and the challenge that's being provided. It's constructive. We'll use that to help make the case to those on the ground that need to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I thank the Minister. That concludes proceedings on the urgent question. Points of order come after statements, after urgent questions and statements, unless it's directly related to the statement, the UK we've just had. It is a point of order, Chair McCrory.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I apologise for not giving you forward notice of my point of order, but it is something that has just occurred. The member for Tiverton and Honiton just referred to the death of one of my constituents, which has just recently happened in relation to this urgent question, without notifying me. And the reason I raise this today, Madam Deputy Speaker, is this is an incredibly sensitive time, and I have connected with the family through the Foreign Office and Development Consular Service, which is the right and proper thing to do. And I am nervous that his name is being taken to score points across the chamber when it is completely inappropriate to do so. And I wonder if you could advise me how we can avoid this in the future.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her point of order. I noted the exchanges to which she refers, and it did occur to me as the exchanges were taking place that the Honourable Member for Tiverton and Honiton should have thought twice before mentioning the name in very, very, very sensitive, sad, indeed tragic circumstances of the constituent of another Member of Parliament. I wonder if he would like to apologise.
Point of order, Madam Deputy Speaker. My point of order is that I'd firstly like to pay tribute to the honourable member for her work on behalf of her constituents. I think that it is the duty of everybody in this chamber to work with sensitive casework as close as we can, and clearly she has done that. I should add that I used my point about an individual who has unfortunately suffered a terrible, awful circumstance, and I think draws a parallel to the 196 aid workers who've been killed in this awful, terrible war.
I thank the honourable gentleman for responding, and we must be very careful because this is as sensitive as a subject possibly can be, and there are bereaved people who will be watching our proceedings. My heart goes out to them, and I'm sure the whole House feels like that. But I understand the honourable lady's point, and I think the honourable gentleman has said that he will be more careful in future. Thank you. We now proceed to the next urgent question. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office if he will make a statement on the deportation of Afghan refugees from Pakistan to Afghanistan.
Minister Trevelyan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UK has a long-standing and close relationship with Pakistan. We engage regularly with the government of Pakistan to advance key priorities and interests, including on human rights and adherence to international law. We are closely monitoring Pakistan's policy on the deportation of Afghanistan's citizens from Pakistan, and we are working with the UNHCR and with IOM to ensure that Pakistan adheres to its international human rights obligations with respect to those affected. We understand that the recently elected government of Pakistan intends to resume their programme of deportations from mid-April following a winter pause, although this has not yet been formally announced. And whilst we respect Pakistan's sovereign right to control its borders, the UK, alongside the international and donor community, are urging Pakistan to do so in accordance with their international obligations. The UK has committed £18.5 million to the International Organisation for Migration, IOM, in Afghanistan to support vulnerable, undocumented returnees from Pakistan and Iran. As part of this work, we have been engaging closely with the government of Pakistan on these measures, and they have assured us of their support in relation to preventing the deportation of Afghans eligible for resettlement in the UK under Afghan Relocations and Assistance Policy, ARAP, or Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, the ACRS scheme. Since the formation of the new Pakistani cabinet, the Foreign Secretary and the British High Commissioner have received assurances from Foreign Minister Dar during discussions on the 25th and the 28th of March, respectively, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would support our relocation